In this lecture, we're talking about caching a reference to a component or components, and specifically, we're going to be able to, when we click on play, have our object go invisible and wait in the air and then drop to the ground after a certain amount of time has elapsed, and also becoming visible. So let's get started. We need a way for our object to interact with the physics system and drop when we click play. How do we go about doing that? What is the component that we need on this? We need a rigid body. So we'll click on add component, search for rigid body, and add that to our dropping object that we've created. Now, if we expand our rigid body component, we can see that there's a few things in here. Of particular importance is use gravity. When I click play, this should drop plump down to the ground. I also would like to have this start invisible. So if we were to click play, we would have this, so the player couldn't see this object at all. They wouldn't look up in the sky and see a whole bunch of blocks and think, why is that block sitting up there in the sky doing nothing? Now, at the moment, we can see it because it's still showing us the box collider, but the player never sees the box collider. That's invisible to the player. Whether we have it on or off, the player can't actually see that green line around the outside. But if we turn on the mesh render, they can see it. If we turn off the mesh render, or the proper terminology here is enable is true or enable is false. So we have or have not enabled it. Similarly, when it comes to gravity, we want to have it so when we click on play, a certain amount of time elapses, gravity starts as off, and then boom, gravity is enabled. And this is just one of many ways for us to get this certain functionality and behavior, but I think it's a great way for us to understand more about components and understand about the properties and variables that components contain. Now let's jump over into dropper.cs. We want to add some things in here. First of all, I'll do this without caching, and then we'll do it with caching, and I'll explain what I mean by caching or caching, depending upon where you're from. We want to go about getting the component. We've done this before. Get component. We need our angle brackets, and within here, the component we need to access or get is what? We'll start with the mesh renderer so that we can do the whole turning on and off in terms of visibility. So we will type in mesh renderer space parentheses, and that understands that we're accessing the mesh renderer component on this game object. We can hit the dot operator in here. There's a bunch of things we can search through. What we're looking for is enabled, or we can just type enabled, hit enter when we've got enough of the word we can find. And then we want to assign enabled to be what? When we very first say go, what do we want to do with the mesh renderer? We want to have it as false. We want to say the mesh renderer is not visible, or it's not enabled, so therefore we're adding it to false. Let's save that, make sure it's working. When we click on play, actually, you know what I'll do? I'll just turn off gravity manually. We'll do that in code in a moment, but we'll just click off use gravity so it stays where it's supposed to. We click on play and it's disappeared. Like I said before, we can see the collision, but the player won't. Now we've gone and got the component and we've set it to false. We're doing two things here at once. We're getting a thing and then we're taking an action on the thing. What if we want to take an action a second time or a third time or a fourth time, turning this on or off or doing something else with the mesh renderer? And it's good for us to have the process of getting the mesh renderer. So saying, hey, go find the mesh renderer. It's good to store that into a variable, and that's what I'm referring to as caching. So a little definition here, caching is a technique of storing frequently used data or information in memory so that it can easily be accessed when needed. In this case, we want to be able to access the mesh renderer. So up above start, but below our serialized field, giving myself a little bit of space here, I'm going to declare a variable, and the variable is going to be of type mesh renderer. And then we need to give it a name. I'm going to call this my mesh renderer. Now, why am I naming it like that? There's a million ways you can name your variables. Some people would name this, for example, they name it MR as mesh renderer. I look at MR and in a week's time, I'm gonna have no idea. Mr. who? Mr. what? Doesn't make sense. And some people might just write it as, oh, it wouldn't let me delete just a couple of things there. Write it as just mesh renderer like that. But for the purpose of teaching you, and I assume that you're at a beginner stage of your journey here, you're looking at that mesh renderer, which is type, and that mesh renderer, which is a variable name. It can get a little bit confusing. So I just want to be really clear that I'm writing my mesh renderer to say this is the variable name, and this mesh renderer here with the uppercase M is the type, which is mesh renderer type. Now we've declared our variable, we need to store the mesh renderer in that. And the way we do this is down in start, I'm going to give myself a new line and start with my mesh renderer, and we're going to assign a value to that, which is going to be my get component of type mesh renderer, parentheses, semicolon. And now instead of having to get the mesh renderer and then to set it to false, I'm going to just type in here, my mesh renderer dot enabled equals false. So it looks like we're writing a lot more code. And when I first started out, I was thinking, why couldn't I just do it the other way? This seems like a lot of work. I've had to type that line and this line and that line, and it was working before. The main reason is now that we've done this once, we can use this cache reference in a number of places. Now let's do the same for Rigidbody. And why is it Rigidbody? Well, we want to be able to access use gravity and switch it on and off at certain times. So here's a little micro challenge for you. Go ahead and see if you can create the same process of caching Rigidbody. The first thing I'll do here is create a variable, which will be of type Rigidbody. And I'll give it a name. Once again, I'll call it my Rigidbody. And again, you'll see a lot of people name Rigidbody just RB like that, and that's fine. And if you see that in other people's code, you'll know what it means. But for now, I just want to be super clear with my variable name so that you understand what's going on. Now that we have our variable, we need to get that component. So I will, underneath mesh renderer, I will start by my Rigidbody, and that will be equals to get component, angle brackets, Rigidbody, parentheses, semicolon. Give myself a bit of a space just so I've got a visual distinction between these two chunks of code. And underneath my mesh renderer, I will write in my Rigidbody. And here it's not dot enabled, it's dot, let's see if we can find the one to do with gravity. There we go, use gravity. And that will be set to or equals false as well at the start. This is at the start. We want these things to turn off. So save back into Unity. We'll make sure that works. We just want to be having our object staying floating up in the air and to have its mesh renderer not visible. Cool. And there we go. Perfect. Now it's time for a challenge to make sure you've been paying attention and to give you a chance to flex your programming muscles. Make this object fall. Add 2 lines of code that make the object become visible and fall after it has waited the right amount of time. So we're in the right script at the moment. All the structure and all the framework is there. If you haven't been taking on the challenges, this is a perfect opportunity to do so. Really have a good think about it, because that's how we learn the most, is when we have to think about these things. So pause the video, have a good old think, and complete that challenge. I'll see you back here when you're ready. Okay, so within here, we've already got a spot where we're saying how long have we had to wait. I'm going to remove my debug.log. We don't need the lookout below anymore. What we need to do is, after a certain amount of time has elapsed, after time to wait has elapsed, we then want to make our mesh renderer enable true and our my Rigidbody use gravity true as well. So I'll grab these 2 lines up above, copy, paste into update, organize them a little bit here, and then just change the status of my mesh renderer dot enabled equals true and my Rigidbody dot use gravity is also true. Save, back to Unity, click on play. Okay, that's good. 1, 2, and then it drops to the ground. Bloop. And we can see that it's changed color, and that's fine. That means it's bounced into something, and in upcoming lectures we'll do it so it only changes color when it bounces into the player. That's all I wanted to cover in this lecture. Good stuff. I'll see you in the next one.